Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. I want to introduce to you um, Janice Silk, and she is a nutrition consultant with Your Nutrition Condition. So let's give her a warm Westminster Canterbury welcome.
I want to thank you all for coming today. Let me take this off and maybe you can actually hear me. There we go. I really want to thank Denise for coordinating all of this and for Westminster Canterbury making it possible for me to be here, and also for Cliff for helping out somebody who can be technically challenged. So thank you, Cliff. Today, what we're going to be talking about is celiac disease and non-gluten celiac sensitivity. And if you have it, how do you live with it? You don't have to consider it a life sentence. You can actually thrive. So as Denise said, my name is Janice Silk, and I'm a nutrition consultant. I have a private practice over on Laxton Road in Lynchburg. And I spend my days just working with people who want to improve their health through nutrition. And there can be any number of concerns that they present with. It can be digestion issues or digestive issues. It can be type 2 diabetes, it can be weight loss, there can be so many things. And then we have the odd person who's proactive. That doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while I do get somebody that comes in and says, I just want to make sure I'm doing the best I can do so that I can keep my health as good as it can be. So that's always a wonderful surprise. But like I said, we tend to not get interested until we've got something going on. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and why I am so interested in this particular topic. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Many years before I had a diagnosis of celiac disease, I had ill health. And ill health might be stretching it a little bit, but it was more I didn't feel good. And this began when I was in my mid-teens, and I had headaches, and I always felt like I was going to pass out, had a little bit of depression, had a lot of anxiety, and really just fatigue and no ambition. I pushed my way through everything. I guess the good part of that is I learned how to do that. So when I felt well, I really could accomplish things. And you know, I went on for years and luckily had a friend who became a chiropractor whose bent was nutrition. This was back before really people were doing that. And he determined that I had hypoglycemia, so I had low blood sugar, and I had some issues with carbohydrates. So as any 20-something-year-old does, they don't feel good, so they give it their all, and then they feel good and they stop doing it. And then they start doing it again, and then life gets in the way because it gets busy. So I had a lot of stops and starts. But that had to end when I started getting really bad flu-like symptoms every single morning. And that was in 2007, 2008. I woke up every morning, and I had the flu from the neck up. My body was just inflamed, my face. I wasn't flushed, I couldn't see any inflammation, but I just felt like I had the flu. And when I got up in the morning and started moving around, sometimes it would get better, sometimes it would get worse. You just never knew what kind of a day it was going to be. And then I went on a little bit longer, and 6 months prior to my diagnosis, I ended up with horrible stomach pains. And that's when I knew something was wrong, because if there was something that didn't hurt on me, it was my stomach. I had a really strong stomach. So I had to navigate the minefield, and it was a minefield back then, of diagnosis, because so many people and doctors and lab technicians really didn't know how to diagnose celiac disease. It's still a bit of an interpretive thing. And so I had to go through do that whole dance, but I was finally diagnosed in 2008. And the good news is since then I have not had a stomach pain, and I have not knowingly ingested any gluten, so I'm really, really strict about it. So let's talk about what celiac disease is. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease, and it affects genetically predisposed individuals upon the ingestion of gluten. And what that means is that there are genes that are responsible for celiac disease. Now, we're not quite all the way there yet with the studies on this, but there's two genes. One is the HLA-DQ8, which 90% of the people have, and there's the HLA-DQ2, which about 10% of the people have. And then there's another, and that's of the 100% that have those two genes. Then there's another 7% that don't have either one of those genes, but are celiac. So, like I said, there's still more research that needs to be done for us to figure out why those 7% have celiac disease. It's an autoimmune disease. The body attacks itself. In the case of celiac disease, the body damages the villi in the small intestine. And this is really important because villi are only in the small intestine, and the small intestine is where we absorb all of our, well, about 95% at least of our nutrients. So the villi, they are like a shag carpet, and they've got these little shags here that produce enzymes that help us to digest our food, because the goal is you digest the food to the point where it's a nutrient, and then it allows it to cross over into the bloodstream because we need it to keep our cells healthy. Our cells will build tissue and organs, and so we start at the bottom and we nourish the cells, and then everything is okay. With celiac disease, because the body is attacking itself, this shag carpet becomes plush carpet. It can no longer produce those enzymes that are needed to break down our food. It also, as they're breaking down, the junctures get wider and allow things into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there. And that's the reason that sometimes it's not just stomach pain, it's, like in my case, just feeling inflammation in my face. So it's really important that those things don't cross the barrier. And things that can cross the barrier are particles of food that are too big and they can't be recognized, and there's no receptor site for them to attach to, so they just create havoc and nothing else. There's viruses, there's bacteria, there's parasites. All of those things start to be able to get into our bloodstream and certainly not leaving us feeling well. And celiac disease is a multi-system disorder. Just imagine you're not getting the nutrients you need. It's going to affect every part of your body. One good example is if you are not being able to absorb your vitamin D and your calcium to aid in healthy bones, then you're going to end up with osteoporosis. So it really does affect every part of our body. Now, this symptoms list is not to say that if you have these things or these symptoms that you should be tested for celiac disease. But what it shows you is how far-reaching it can be and how many things can happen as a result of celiac disease. So if you have bone or joint pain, you're not going to go into a doctor and they're not going to say, oh, let's check you for celiac disease, nor should they. Because there's other things that are more obvious. But when the obvious things start to get ruled out, then we have to start looking at what are some of the things that aren't as common to us, like celiac disease. But unfortunately, it is getting common. So this is just a list of what can happen, and I would say probably the most common ones with celiac disease are bone and joint pain, can be depression and anxiety because we're not getting the B vitamins we need and the minerals we need to support our health. And I might have this in a slide a little bit down the road, but just in case I don't, I just want to mention that back in the 60s and 70s, we finally figured out that the gut-brain connection wasn't a one-way street. It's a two-way street. We know about serotonin. We know about how depression and anxiety can occur as a result of not having enough. Well, 90% of the serotonin resides in the digestive tract. And if we are not keeping the digestive tract healthy, then there's a signal sent up to the brain that just doesn't allow us to have the neurotransmitters and things that we need in order to mentally be healthy. There's also dopamine. There's 50% of our dopamine, which is usually it keeps us focused. It keeps us having some ambition, and 50% of that is found in the gut. So the gut can actually be called the second brain. It's that important. Two things that are really common with celiac disease are diarrhea or constipation, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be you've got diarrhea one week and constipation the next week or the next day. It really can go back and forth that way. I think stomach pain. Stomach pain is definitely one, and weight loss is another one that's very common to celiac disease, and inflammation. So some of these are more common in celiac disease than others, but it really can bring on all of these symptoms. Conditions to look for in children. Children are sometimes so resilient that they're not great self-reporters. And in older children, we can see damaged in tooth enamel, and so we really need to do some investigation into that. If we know that a family member has celiac, they have such a good chance of having either the DQ8 or the DQ2 gene that they really should be tested for celiac disease. And then there's delayed puberty, because when we're not absorbing our nutrients, our hormones, it's just like the domino effect. Hormones more so than anything else in our body. When one goes out of whack, all of them go out of whack. So there's delayed puberty. And then there's failure to thrive in infants. I have a great example of this. When I was living in Canada, and this was, I don't know, 35 years ago maybe, a neighbor's 2-year-old was diagnosed with celiac. And at the time, I felt really bad for her because kids go to birthday parties, they have so much exposure to gluten, and it's like, how do you tell a kid to start asking questions before they eat something? It's near impossible. And as bad as I felt for this child and this mom, what I wasn't at the time was impressed, because I was just like, he's a doctor, he diagnosed it. Looking back, I am so impressed, because I'm not even sure celiac was on the radar at that point. And to diagnose a child at 2 years old as quickly as she was diagnosed was definitely impressive. Now, we can't talk about damaged digestion before we talk about normal digestion. So let's just do a brief overview of that. So digestion actually starts before the mouth. When we say that we smell something and it makes our mouth water, it truly does. And it gets the salivary glands started, and they have enzymes in them, and that helps to break down and start the digestion process. Then from the mouth, it goes into the esophagus. Now, in the esophagus, there is something that's called peristalsis, and peristalsis is like a kneading motion in your intestine, and it moves your food through. And it moves it through into the stomach, where hydrochloric acid, or HCl, and some other peptin, lipase, start to digest the food. It's really important that we chew our food really well, and that way the enzymes can actually get to the food better and start to digest them. And then after it's in the stomach and it's further digested and it's turned into something called chyme, it enters the small intestine. And here is where the bugaboo is with celiac disease. At least 95% of our nutrients are absorbed in our small intestine. And if we have flattened the villi, and if there are no enzymes being produced, and if there are junctures that are wide open that are letting food through before they get digested properly, we are not getting the nutrients we need. We really need to break that food down into a single nutrient that can cross the mucosal membrane and get into the bloodstream, and then is taken in by the cells as needed. Once it goes into the small intestine, and once that is done, then it goes into the large intestine, and the large intestine will absorb a few more nutrients that have gotten through the small intestine, will also reabsorb some water, and then there's elimination. So that's a pretty picture of normal digestion. Now with celiac, it's not such a pretty picture. So here is villus atrophy and what it looks like. So you can see on the left-hand side that we've got a healthy villi, and there's all kinds of sites there, receptor sites and enzymes being produced, and this is how we absorb our nutrients and we feed our cells to go on to do bigger and better things in our body. On the right-hand side, you can see damaged villi. Everything's just going right past it. There's nothing to stop it. There's nothing to absorb it. There's no enzymes to break it down. So that's villus atrophy. Now, how do we know if we have villus atrophy? And let me just start by saying that anybody that has been on this journey knows that you don't just walk into a doctor's office one day and say, I think I have celiac. You start out with these crazy little aches and pains that you're not sure what they are, and you usually start getting tested for different things. And I mean, that's normal, and that's the way it should be, because celiac isn't the first thing you think of when there's some of these things going on. But if you have too many digestive problems and too much pain, a gastroenterologist is going to do an endoscopy. And in that endoscopy, they rate it on there's a Marsh scale, and there's also one that's an updated Marsh scale that's a little bit different in the stages, but for this presentation, you'll understand what I'm trying to get across. So stage 1 and 2, there's too many lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are a part of your immune system that comes into play when they feel that there's a threat and they need to fight it. So why are there too many lymphocytes? So that needs to be found out. Stage 3, there's villus atrophy begins. So it's not just like you've got this healthy villi and then they lay down. You know, it's a gradual thing. And then some of the classifications now say stage 3A, 3B, and 3C, but it used to be stage 4, and it's all the same. And that's when there's total villus atrophy. Now, you know, wherever you land or wherever somebody lands on this scale, they really need to be gluten-free. Now, there's another form of celiac disease that only affects the skin, and it's dermatitis herpetiformis. And this is where someone could go in and have an endoscopy, and 20% of those people with celiac disease have a normal villi or a normal biopsy, yet they've got this dermatitis or pediformis. So you can't always go by the endoscopy. So you can see where it kind of gets a little tricky and a little interpretive. However, it's come a long way and gotten a lot easier. There are also other related conditions, and there's a whole basket of neurological manifestations, and these really have to be dealt with. Even if you're on a gluten-free diet, you really need to work at this a bit. So peripheral neuropathy, you know, your arms fall asleep when they shouldn't, your toes are numb, and you've got pain. Now, that can also happen for a lot of other reasons. So it doesn't mean you have celiac disease, but what it can mean is that if you have celiac disease, this can likely happen. And then there's ataxia or balance, and I find this is really common. So we start to lose our balance. I think it's especially the people with, I don't want to say, but there's one of the genes that if that's the gene that you have, those people generally have a problem with balance, and it's probably DQ8. And then there's brain atrophy and dementia. Well, this is really no great shock. If you've got your digestive system not working right, and if your dopamine isn't as high as it should be, and if your serotonin isn't as high as it should be, your brain is not being fed the food that it needs in order to stay healthy. So it's just really imperative, if you have celiac disease, that you take it seriously. I've met people that had celiac disease and say, I only have wheat once in a while. And I'm not necessarily a real stick-to-it type of person, but that is just something I would not consider. Migraines can occur. They can occur with celiac disease. There's blood flow issues intracranially, and so it can be dilation, it can be constriction of the arteries, and so migraines can happen, and even epilepsy can happen. Now, there's some other related conditions that aren't neurological, and there's unfortunately too many of them. So osteoporosis, and we talked about that before. If you're not absorbing the vitamins you need to take care of your skeletal needs, when your body needs calcium for other reasons, it's going to rob it from your bones. It's going to get it. But what you're going to end up with is osteopenia or osteoporosis. Depression. Depression is due to malabsorption of especially the B vitamins that we need. And also the reaction to celiac disease, physically and mentally. We all have pretty busy lives, and when somebody is diagnosed with celiac disease, you've just given them another part-time job. And it's really hard if you're living in a family situation where the rest of the family doesn't want to eat gluten-free. So it can be hard, and it can also be hard with eating out, not because there aren't options. I was raised that whatever somebody put in front of you, you ate. And I was fine with that because I liked everything. But then I had to start being that person in the restaurant that said, are you sure there's no croutons in that salad? Are you sure there's no this? Are you sure there's no that? And my mother cringed every time I did it because we just weren't supposed to do that. And she didn't get celiac disease. She didn't understand how devastating it is and how important it was for me to follow that diet. And I remember once I thought I was studying and I'm just going to go out and I'm going to study while I'm eating my dinner. I don't want to make dinner. And I went through this whole conversation with the wait staff and said, you know, just please make sure they don't put croutons in my salad. And she said, you don't like them? And I said, oh no, I love them. I said, but I can't have them because I'm celiac. I can't have any. Sometimes I use the word wheat because people don't understand the gluten. So we had that whole conversation, and I said, and please write it on the order so that, you know, in case somebody else reads it that you haven't talked to, I don't get the croutons. So that was all fine. And I'm sitting there waiting for my salad, and she arrives with a plate of garlic bread. And I thought, she didn't get it. But anyway, so it made me laugh anyway. So there's also malignancies that can occur as a result of having celiac disease. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid cancer, adenocarcinoma of the small intestine, which makes sense because your small intestine has just been doing battle, esophageal cancer, and melanoma. Also, there's the thyroid disease. There's Hashimoto's disease, which is hypothyroidism, and Graves' disease, which is hyperthyroidism. Now, I need to point out here that you can have hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism without having these autoimmune versions of them. So it doesn't mean that if you have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, it does not mean that you have an autoimmune disease. And then there's infertility in male and females, and this is the least studied part at this point, so there's still a lot more research to be done. Now, although we don't know exactly why these conditions exist with celiac disease, we know that they often do. I think, in my humble opinion, that it's just common sense that if we're not getting the nutrients that we need, different systems in our body are going to break down. So again, that's why anybody that has this disorder really needs to stick to it. And you know, years ago, there weren't many good alternatives. If you ate something because it was gluten-free, you ate it to fill your stomach. You didn't eat it because you were going to enjoy it. There was just nothing good out there. That is not the case now. There's a lot of good alternatives. Getting back to whole food is probably one of the best ones, but as I said before, we live in a busy world, and sometimes we just need to eat some of those different foods. Now, there's also something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So this means that you don't have an autoimmune disease. The gastrointestinal symptoms are just about the same as those with celiac disease. But there is no tissue transglutaminase autobodies or autoimmune comorbidities. So what that's really saying is you don't have an autoimmune. And what they used to say, and the reason I have a question mark next to this is because the jury is still out on it, is that there's no signs of intestinal damage or increased permeability. I believe that there is, or can be. So there's two types of permeability. There's transient permeability and there's pathological. So transient is when, you know, your small intestine, the villi in it, experience a little bit of an assault, whether it's from something they shouldn't be eating, a food sensitivity, whether it's wheat, whether it's medication, long-term medication, but it usually can keep repairing itself to some point. Pathological permeability is when you really, it doesn't bounce back. So you have to do something to make that happen. It's not just in your innate healing system. So diagnostics. How do you know the difference between celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity? This looks like a pretty scary slide, and it really, what you need to know is that there's some real cutting edge labs out there now, and I work with one of them that has a staff of dietitians, nutritionists, doctors that pore over this stuff and discuss results with you. It can still be a little interpretive. However, if you see under the blood column, anything that has CD after it, if you are out of range for those things, they consider that you have celiac disease. Now, the anti-gluten IgG antibodies, that can be either one, and that's where it can become a little interpretive. And you compare that, not compare, you can pair that with another test. And like you could do an inexpensive gene test, and it would tell you if you have the gene DQ2 or DQ8. And then if that was out of range, that would probably be, yes, you have celiac disease. The top two really just show you that you can get that testing done through saliva or blood. And also, the lab that I work with, almost everything was a blood draw, but they had some things where you could do a finger stick and you could do it at home and you could put it on their little kit that they had and send it in. With the advent of COVID, they have figured out how to do that with everything except for one test. So it doesn't have to be a blood draw. It can be just a finger prick. Now, the biopsies, that's where some people start because they have such stomach pain, but you don't necessarily have to have a biopsy in order to be diagnosed. As a matter of fact, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And when it wouldn't make sense would be if you have some insights into nutrition, and if you're having stomach issues and have had a lot of tests done and they're all negative, and you're thinking, well, maybe gluten is the culprit, and you stop eating gluten for 6 months, but you still have a little bit of pain, you could go in for an endoscopy and it could be normal, and that would be a false normal. So sometimes the endoscopy is necessary, and if you go to a gastroenterologist, they would probably say it's always important, but that's just a matter of opinion. And then there's the dermatitis herpetiformis. That's something where if you're going to be tested, you want to go to a dermatologist that has a real clear idea of how to do this. So in other words, the eruption site itself is not where you want to take the biopsy from. You want to take it from the skin that's adjacent to it. So it doesn't hurt to advocate for yourself a little bit and do some research before you go to a doctor. So much out there these days, they can't know everything. So how to live without gluten and thrive. And I just want to say it really is possible, but it really is a huge learning curve. So obviously, no gluten-containing grains. So wheat, barley, rye, and spelt. Oats have something that's kind of a close cousin to gluten, and people that shouldn't have gluten can sometimes react. Now, I am one of those that think that if you don't react, it doesn't mean you still eat it, because I didn't start out with any pain in my stomach. So I'm convinced that there was a lot of damage going on, and I have a fairly high pain threshold, and I wasn't feeling it. And it's just so easy to buy gluten-free oats. Like some other foods, gluten-free oats taste just like oats, or unlike some other foods, I should say. And then there's some ancient grains if people are really curious and creative and want to use some of the ancient grains. They also have gluten in them, so thank goodness for Google. You can just Google and find out if there is gluten in that type of grain. As a nutrition consultant, I really like for people to get their nutrients from their food. But there is a time and a place for supplements. Sometimes it's in an acute stage. Sometimes it's just as a little bit of an insurance policy that you're getting enough. Our food, by and large, is not grown the way it used to be. I think we're really making some great strides in that. But for instance, somebody with celiac disease, you want them to be able to digest and absorb their nutrients, but until you repair their gut, it's not going to happen. So you really have to repair the small intestine. And to do that, there's something called L-glutamine, which is very good for repairing that. And then the digestion will get a little bit better, but you may need some digestive enzymes to help break down the food so that it's easier to digest. Anemia, you might need some iron, or you might need some B12. Quite often, people with celiac disease end up anemic. I think back, and, my family never even thought about this, I'm sure, and I've never mentioned it to them, but I have a grandmother that I never met, and she died of pernicious anemia. Well, my celiac disease came from somewhere. And I suspect that she's the one that had the gene. So you might need a supplement there. And then cellular health, just to be on the safe side, it's always good, especially when you've got a condition or a disease that's compromising you, that you vitamin D when you're not getting outside, so vitamin D especially in the winter, multiple vitamin and maybe some calcium. So supplements are necessary sometimes, but I would like as a nutritionist for people to get their digestive system to the stage where they can get it from their food and they're eating healthy food that's able to give it to them. Now, exercise is on here, and it's just, the word I like to use is movement. So I don't care if people do calisthenics, aerobics, a marathon. It's just important to stay moving. It really keeps our blood flowing and keeps the oxygen flowing through our body. Anything that, with weights helps with osteoporosis. And, like I said, as a celiac, I find that those things are really necessary because I know that I'm at a higher risk than most people. But the big thing I want to talk about on this slide is diaphragmatic breathing. That's a fancy word for deep breathing. We tend to be so busy, people breathe from about here up. I tell my daughter that she's wearing her shoulders for earrings. She's always like this. I'm like, breathe. And it really doesn't have to be anything that's even noticeable or anything that you can't be doing while you're doing something else. I'm not a huge proponent of multitasking all the time, but you could take 3 deep breaths before you eat. You could take 3 deep breaths when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night. It's all important. And you can take 1 deep breath and feel the difference. So this is just, it's free, it's easy. You can be sitting at a table with people eating dinner. They don't know you're doing it. It's just something that's wonderful to do. And one of the reasons is there's a really long nerve in your body called the vagus nerve. And this vagus nerve is responsible for so many of the reactions in our body. It's particularly responsible for our heart, our lungs, and our digestion. And every time you do deep breathing, you exercise that vagus nerve. And as we get older, it actually shrinks. So just a way to keep this in good shape is to do some deep breathing. And I highly, highly, highly suggest that. Now, everything that I've told you today, you can find out on your own because we have Google. And you can come up with all of this information, and the problem is it takes forever. So to work with a nutrition consultant is probably the best thing to do to just get over this learning curve. And I know that a lot of you are here today, you're just curious. You don't think you've got celiac disease, but it's just this kind of applies to anybody that's got anything. You can get it all through Google, and make sure you go to a reputable website, especially not one that says ad. And what I do with my clients that come in, and regardless of what they have, I do meal and lifestyle planning. I cannot hand them a canned version of this is what you do if you have type 2 diabetes, this is what you do if you're overweight, this is what you do if you have kidney disease. I have to take their lifestyle into consideration, because if it doesn't fit into their lifestyle, they're going to do it for a month, maybe, and then it's just going to become too cumbersome and it's not going to fit in and they're not going to be able to do it. So meal and lifestyle planning is really important. And then learn to read labels. There's a handout on the table, and that definitely just pertains to celiac disease, but there are so many unregulated terms or terms that can be used through the FDA that don't need to divulge what's in them. And so you may read something on a label and it doesn't say wheat, it doesn't say gluten, and yet there is wheat or gluten in it. So better yet, eat foods without a label. Then you don't have to worry about it so much. And to discover wise choices when eating out. You know, we talked about that a little bit, and it's gotten so much better. But know the questions to ask and don't feel bad about it. The way that I got around that was to say, I'm educating them, whether they want to be or not. And I just felt like it made it easier for the next person that came after me that had to ask those questions. Maybe now they would know the answer to that. And then we discussed medications, cosmetics, and supplements. All supplements are not created equal. There's a lot of fillers in them, and the reason is not to really make it cheaper for the most part. It's because if they don't put these fillers in, it binds up their machines. So I guess it, does save them money. But when you put those fillers in there, it keeps them from being as absorbable. So most supplements, if you get them from a provider that just will sell to practitioners, most of them now do not have gluten in them. Most don't have dairy, nuts, shellfish, all of the usual suspects for sensitivities. Medications, same thing. Some of them, because gluten is a binder, and so they use it. So you have to be careful of medications. And then people would say, why cosmetics? Well, we heard for so long that gluten cannot go through your skin and get into your bloodstream. And that is absolutely true. It can't. But it can, if you're putting on lipstick or chapstick or face cream, it can get into your mouth. And so you're ingesting gluten. Now, as I said before, some people aren't that sensitive, but it doesn't mean it's not going in and not doing any damage that you're not feeling. And, years ago, this might have been a pretty tall order, but now we have resources, we have lists, we have things that will show us, not that they don't change from time to time, and they start doing something else with the ingredients, but pretty much if they started out making a product that didn't have gluten in it, they pretty much know that they should not reverse that, because people are going to end up in trouble. So medical management. We also can thrive through medical management. We have to know if we're doing better, or if some of those things that coexist with celiac are still healthy systems in our body. So blood tests can tell us whether the IgA is back into range and if we're doing well. I wouldn't do a follow-up intestinal biopsy for a couple or a few years, because that can take a while to fully heal, and we don't want to get a false negative. And as we saw back in the other screen with some of the things that you can develop from having celiac disease, one of them was melanoma. So malignancy screenings are very important. So I guess what I'm really trying to get across to you today, because like I said, I don't know but I think that probably most of you here are curious or maybe know somebody that is having health issues and would like to give them this information, but don't actually know anybody that's suffering, or you're not yourself suffering. But when it comes to anything with your health, if you keep going to the doctor, and if you keep looking like the perfect specimen on paper, but you're experiencing some issues, see a nutrition consultant, because it can just be a food sensitivity. There might be something that you have to take out of your diet. It can be just that you're not eating right at all. And, I do unfortunately get some clients that have no insight into what healthy food is. And once we get them on a routine and some healthy food, then everything goes away. One of the things that makes me look brilliant when I'm not is that I just get people drinking the right amount of water. And just in the last couple months, I've had 2 people come back for a second visit, and they said, "Oh my gosh, everything's working again." And so how easy is that? So I just, if you can't get relief from your doctor, or if somebody you know is suffering and can't get relief from going to the doctor, do some investigation and see if it's nutrition. I want to thank you all, and I think we have time for some questions. They can be related to celiac or not. I would be happy to answer them. Yes? Okay. Yeah, the question was, wheat can be a common filler for ice cream. If you go in the grocery store now, they usually have a GF on the label where the price is that shows that it's gluten-free. Now, there are other things that are gluten-free that are not marked gluten-free. So here's where it gets confusing. If they're not made in a dedicated environment where they're being manufactured, if other things are being made with gluten, they can't advertise them as gluten-free. But yes, they're absolutely, because it's a binder. And it's not so much for the more basic ice creams like chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, things like that. And it can also be in there. But where you see it is like the obvious places, cookies and cream and, things like that, where that there would be, where they have more add-ins. Yeah. Yeah, the farro, I can't remember because I don't use, the question was, in corn and farro, is there gluten? So the farro, honestly, I'm drawing a blank. I can't remember because I don't use it and I don't have clients that use it. Corn doesn't have gluten. However, for whatever reason, people that have celiac disease tend to not do well with corn. Even people without celiac disease, it's a very hard thing to digest. So it's one of those things that if somebody had celiac disease, I would say really stay away from it. If you're going out to dinner and it's a one-time thing or a very infrequent thing, fine. I just wouldn't put it in your rotation, in your everyday diet. Yeah. Yes.
What you just said, does that include cornmeal?
The question is, does cornmeal, is it hard to digest, and does it contain gluten? Is that right? Okay. Again, cornmeal is something where you have to read the label. I still think it's a little hard on the digestion. I think it's something that if you have problems with digestion or have celiac disease, that it would be an infrequent food. But what happens a lot of times is that the actual food itself doesn't necessarily have gluten in it, but just on their conveyor belts and to keep things from sticking and doing things, they may use gluten. And that's why foods that are actually sort of naturally gluten-free, when they're made in those facilities, they can't advertise them as gluten-free. The other thing I want to say about that is that the natural place for everybody to start when they're diagnosed with something is to go into the grocery store and buy a product that says it doesn't have any of that in it. So whether it's gluten-free or sugar-free or whatever. And that's a good place to start while you're on the learning curve. But you've got to also get out of that. A product can be considered gluten-free if it has less than, I think it's 20 parts per million of gluten in it. So it can have some gluten in it and still pass the test. But think of it this way, they're going by a serving. And some people don't eat a serving. Or some people buy another processed food product that has 20 parts per million, and they eat it in the same day. So now the gluten's starting to add up. So whole foods, while my goal is always to get people to eat well 80% of the time. Then those 20% of little indulgences aren't going to really make us sick. But, you know, we do need to be careful. And with celiac, it's one of the conditions where you probably have to be more careful than anything else, because think about it. Diabetes, there's a pill. Diabetes, there's insulin. What is there for celiac disease? There's food. So that's, yeah. Sure. Right. I wish I had a picture of it. It's really like an eruption, and it's kind of raw looking and round and red, and all depending on the amount or the severity of it, they can actually, the little eruptions can start all going together, and then it becomes a big rash. And those people, sometimes that's the only symptom they have. They have no gut issues. Right.
So, it's so hard to make these appointments with somebody that, somebody has recommended, and you go. I mean, what kind of questions do you ask? They're a physician, they're a dermatologist. Do you know anything about, celiac? How do you determine that they're going to be a good person?
Right. So the question is, you need to go to medical providers that have some really good insights to the disease, especially with celiac disease, and how do you know which ones they are. The way that you know is by doing just a little bit of research on your own, or talking. Most conditions or diseases have a type2diabetes.org or celiac.org, where you can get just a little bit of information that's going to go a long way. So now when you make that phone call, you know what you're asking for. So, and you make them aware. You sort of put them on notice that you know what you're asking for. So just say you had that rash and you wanted to have that biopsy. You could take a piece of paper with you that from the research that shows where you want it done. Years ago, this probably would have gone over like a lead balloon. I believe that the patient and the doctor are having more of a collaborative visit at this point, and the egos are getting out of the way. As a matter of fact, they may even be glad that you do it. And that's the stand I have to take. Like when I'm in a restaurant, it's like, oh, maybe they're glad that they know this now. That's what I tell myself anyway. But, or talk to someone. There's probably even a website that's just for the dermatitis herpetiformis. And so that's how I would approach it. And I would start with when you make the appointment, not when you get in there in the doctor's office. I would question the person that's making the appointment, and they could very likely say, I'll get back with you, because they have to check with the doctor, but you deserve the treatment you need, and you deserve for it to be accurate. You're welcome. Okay, does anybody else have any questions?
I would like the one where you have the flour tortilla and they say, we're going to substitute a corn tortilla for you. And I kind of think there's a lot of gluten in corn tortilla.
Yeah, I can be suspect too, and I can sometimes get drawn into it, like after I haven't had a tortilla for a year. It's like, but it's corn. So there are, and I don't know that this is the stance I should take on it, but there are now enzymes that are available through my providers that will help digest gluten. So if I were going to have a one-time thing and not sure of what's in it, now if I really thought it had gluten in it, not doing it. But I'm just suspect there might be a little, or it might have been made in a facility that, wasn't exactly gluten-free. I could take 2 of those little pills, and what they have is the enzyme that will digest the gluten. There's one that just does gluten. There's one that does dairy and gluten. And the important thing about that is that most people who have celiac disease, until they effect some kind of repair in their gut, are also lactose intolerant, because the enzyme in the villi aren't being produced. So the lactate is not being produced. Lactase, I should say, is not being produced. When you start to build the villi up again, most people that are celiac can go back to dairy.
That was going to be one of my questions. Can it coexist with another, allergy? Because usually, if you're gluten intolerant, I also seem to have problem with fat, and especially dairy. So you kind of answered the question there. And also the fact that, ice cream can have gluten in it.
Yeah.
How about like cream in your coffee? Like that.
No, that's all good. It's like I said, we're talking about cream in the coffee, and we're talking about ice cream having gluten in it, and just how frustrating it can be to find out all the places that they sneak it, not only all the places they sneak it, but under what terms, which is one of the handouts. So again, we have a whole lot more options than we ever had, and we just have to do the best we can. I am a firm believer, especially if you don't have celiac disease and have to be very careful, I am a firm believer that you should really treat your body kindly when it comes to nutrition, but not to the point where there's a term that we use. It's called orthorexic, where you are so afraid of everything that's going to make you sick, that the stress is going to make you sick from worrying about it. So you have to stop that. And then those things that you may feel don't agree with you so much, they really just have to become whether they're meal-type foods, they have to become a fast food for you, where it's something you grab when you just can't do anything else. Or if it's a treat type of food, it just has to be something that's infrequent. And watch the portion size. You're welcome. Okay, there's some, because I knew that everybody that came here today, some were going to be curious, some had some real concerns maybe about celiac for themselves or someone they knew. There's some handouts that just pertain to celiac disease, but then there's 2 handouts that are just good suggestions for optimizing your health, some changes that you want to make. And the great thing about nutrition is that you can make small changes that make a big difference. So if you want to help yourself to that would be great. If any of them are gone and run out, just let Denise or myself know, and we'll make sure that we get one to you. Thank you so much.